Korea, and Japan share characteristics with traditional Western or Northern donors, as well as Asian South-South cooperation providers. So the labels are historically important, but present and constrain, limit us from recognizing and shaping the evolving discourse. So Emma and others have described the current landscape as something that is more polycentric. And I would add to this and argue as my second point that what we're seeing is an increase in multilateralism from the South. And this is evidenced through different kinds of banks, financing mechanisms, funds, and platforms. So today, we've heard this already, we have, in addition to the traditional multilateral financial mechanisms, we have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we have the New Development Bank, as well as a multitude of other Southern-led development banks that are financing development, which offers up many more opportunities for finance for developing countries, but also new forms of governance in the multilateral finance field. As well, there's a number of new funds. So China, particularly in the UN, China is now the third largest contributor to the United Nations regular budget. And they've also committed to increasing their contributions over time. We heard this morning about the India's UN Development Partnership Fund. As well, there's the India, Brazil, South Africa Facility for Poverty and Hunger Alleviation, the IBSA Fund. In addition, there's platforms. So there's increased engagement by the South in regional and global platforms, the G20, the Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation, BRICS, the Global South-South Development Forums, IBSA, Green Climate Fund. This trend towards multilateralism is somewhat tempered by the whole concept of national interest. And we've heard a little bit about this morning. Emma mentioned it again, but this is now central to cooperation programs across the board, north, south, east, west. And one point of clear evidence in the north or in the Western countries is the merger or folding of many development agencies in the north or west into ministries of foreign affairs. And in this sense, the north is approaching the southern model of cooperation. Mutual benefit, as we know, has always been kind of a mainstay, a key principle of South-South cooperation. A fourth trend is the growth before or growth for poverty emphasis. So the principles and modalities of traditional aid have changed. The poverty and governance discourse of the 90s and the early 2000s has been taken over by the resurgence of the economic growth discourse, especially inclusive growth. So are we going back to something that's about trickle down, for example? And part of this push for growth is what I call big ticket development projects around infrastructure and connectivity, particularly. And these target the global infrastructure gap of $57 trillion, which the world needs to achieve by 2030. It's all about growth, connectivity, but also people-to-people partnerships. Key projects, of course, are the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. In terms of southern country perspectives, we have in the Philippines, Duterte's famous Build, Build, Build scheme. So the world is really embracing the push for infrastructure and connectivity. Practically, this means roads, ports, bridges, railways, power, special economic zones, and industrial parks. And is very much being led by China, India, Japan, Korea, and is financed by various financial institutions. Some of these are commercial, some of these are development, lines of credit, government-backed loans, etc. Also, Paulo mentioned a point which is interesting as well, that Western or Northern countries are taking another look at their country portfolios, not just from a poverty perspective as they used to prioritize the poorest of the poor, the poorest countries. And there's really a shift to look more at upper middle income countries. And while he mentioned it was relevant in Latin America, it's also very true in Asia. So you have countries like Australia and others starting to look more closely or revisit countries that they had graduated in the past. So Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, countries that are emerging as upper middle income countries. And the idea is to prevent them from slipping back into a state where there's large pockets of poverty and encouraging growth. Fifth, there's also an international consensus that contemporary development challenges are global and shared. And of course, this is embodied in the SDG agenda, which is very different from the MDGs, which reinforce the North-South binary and delegated roles and responsibilities for developed and developing nations. So the focus on public goods as well as poverty. Even the UN is publicly lauding that there is a commitment within the BRI to the SDGs and multilateralism. There's also a recognition, however, that the SDGs cannot be addressed by aid alone, and this leads to my sixth trend, which is the Beyond Aid discourse. So Beyond Aid argues that achieving the SDGs requires more than aid and more actors beyond states and governments. And this has led to new forms of partnerships within the North, South, and across both. The private sector, of course, is key. This is not new to South-South cooperation at all, but is really being reconceptualized in the Western discourse. What we see in the North is the introduction of new forms of finance being called blended finance, which is using public funds to leverage other funds, particularly from the private sector. Something that hasn't been mentioned yet today is the whole concept of the social economy, which is a newer concept which involves social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and shared value, all designed to make the economy work more for social issues, so trading for social and financial gain, and leveraging the huge resources of the private sector. The traditional donors are all over this now, so you hear about the US Global Development Lab, the Australian Innovation Exchange, the UK Innovation Hub. This is all venture-style development. It is designed to appeal to the entrepreneurial millennials, and there's lots of funds being kind of thrown into this to look for new and innovative ideas. Another newer partnership for South-South cooperation is the partnership with civil society. So for decades, NGOs have served as principal partners in implementing traditional development systems, but historically they have not had a significant presence in South-South cooperation. However, this is changing, and particularly in Asia, you see that NGOs are becoming much more involved in development and South-South cooperation, including in development policy. However, across Asia, there are differences. So Japan and Korea have long established partnerships with NGOs in development cooperation, and they have formal mechanisms for state-NGO dialogue and policy influence. India has a rich, active, and diverse NGO culture on domestic development policy and implementation. But Indian NGOs play a negligible role at the present in Indian South-South cooperation. And that's because of a very strict regulatory environment which does not allow Indian CSOs to use their income outside India. And also the Indian government has had a preference for state-led South-South cooperation. However, there are informal channels for influence over policy dialogue. And I think this atmosphere in India is going to change. China is a very different story. The Ministry of Commerce in China has incorporated CSOs into its overall policymaking process and emphasized coordination and supervision by NGOs at the local level in partner countries. And it's also launched some trial aid programs based on government CSO cooperation. China's also established a South-South Cooperation Development Fund, and NGOs will be one of the key partners in that fund. A third type of partnership, of course, is triangular partnerships, and we have heard a lot about those, and those are gaining momentums. MOUs are being signed across the board. China has MOUs probably with every country that you can possibly think of. India has partnerships as well. The latest one is with the UK-India Development Partnership. You're seeing some countries definitely use triangular partnerships to leverage the China in particular. Australia in the Pacific is a good example. For years, Australia complained that they were the only donor working in the Pacific and tried to encourage other people to work there. China now is all over the Pacific, and this is being considered in a very different light. However, China and Australia are working on some successful triangular partnerships, particularly around malaria in PNG. So just to point out quickly a couple of the challenges of some of these new trends. The current trends present their own sets of challenges, none of which are particularly new to development in general, however. The infrastructure push and China's model of no-strings, speedy delivery has led to major debt problems for partner countries. Sri Lanka is perhaps the best-known case, but we also see debt in the Pacific Islands. Delivery issues. Execution and completion is a big problem. And it's being shown more than we know. Particularly, we can see that in India, as well as with Chinese projects. Evaluation is, as the scope grows, impact becomes very important. I also want to mention the rule-based order. We're hearing a lot about this vague language that countries should be playing by the rules. But the key targets for this are China, yes, but also the US. And lastly, sustainability. It's becoming increasingly important, a kind of return to human-faced development. This is nothing new, but we're seeing it as a new priority for China. So they're really looking more and more at responsible investment, for example. I have a conclusion, but I think I will end there just to say that in this new era of development cooperation, we really need to find new terminology that is inclusive of the shared challenges we are trying to address, but also which allows space and scope for the distinctiveness and the diversity of approaches without labeling or stereotyping. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antea. I'm very sorry, I know you have much more to say, and thank you for your reflections. Although you said at the very beginning that you would present an Asian perspective, I think you have been able to present a South perspective because your presentation covered many issues. I would just like to highlight some of your comments. One is that the South is not uniform, but solidarity is there in order to allow for South-South cooperation, which is based on principles of equality and mutual benefit. I think that's a very important concept. We need to recognize that the South is diverse, but be able to get unity while recognizing that this diversity exists. You have mentioned a number of institutional changes, including new funding, which is available, changes in perspective. And you also mentioned, I think this is very important to highlight, that the SDGs cannot be addressed just on the basis of aid. So you need something else. Thank you very much for all these comments and suggestions. So next step is we have 3 commentators. So now I will ask the co-chair, Professor Raman, to continue with the session. I think we may have 5 minutes for each commentator, but Professor Raman will be able to chair this. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to join the Chair in registering my deep appreciation of this initiative by RIS and the partners. I think that I was part of the 2013 first Delhi discourse, and this was a very learning process, this session, and I could see the evolution of our understanding and the deepening of our understanding with regard to South-South cooperation. The actors, the partnerships, the modalities of implementation, the measurement of development effectiveness from the perspective of South-South cooperation. I think that we are progressing, towards a more deepened understanding of what are the issues involved, and our panelists have really helped us in that context. And I was looking and trying to understand what the panelists were sharing from the perspective of least developed countries. 47 of the countries in the global south are least developed countries, my own country, Bangladesh, including. 15 of these LDCs will be graduating in the next few years. And when they graduate, they will not be eligible for preferential treatment, market access. Many of these countries are graduating to the middle income, from low income country to the middle income status. So they will also not be eligible for the World Bank IDA type 0.75% interest rate. So the whole world is changing for many of these LDCs. So there is, I would say, there is not only push factor but also pull factors. Both centrifugal and centripetal forces are working in terms of drawing us towards more deepened South-South cooperation. So I think this is very important. And also many of these, our countries, it is era of the SDGs, triangulation of economic growth, social inclusiveness, environmental sustainability. So I think that this is also very important, that we also implement the SDGs with no one having been left behind, and how South-South cooperation can help us. So thank you, panelists, for your contribution. We now have 3 special comments, as the chair has already mentioned. The only distinction between the panelists and the special comments is that the special commentators will have to distill their ideas within 5 minutes, not 10.
On the learned panelists, I'm just going to come on to actual numbers like a good banker. What is actually happening on South-South as regards trade and investment? If you see the numbers, they are highly encouraging. Developing countries have been consolidating their share in global trade, which was about 32% in the year 2000, just at the turn of the millennium, is 44% today, a significant jump up. And if you look at global FDI inflows over the same period, it shot up from 17% to 47% as far as the developing world is concerned. So clearly, the numbers are encouraging as far as the South is concerned. What about the South-South angle in terms of developing countries providing cooperation? This was 66% in 2015, significantly up, and moved further up to 74% in 2017. South-South exports, if we look at that particular category, also shot up almost sixfold, from 644 billion in 1996, about 20 years ago, to over 4 trillion US dollars in 2016. So the share also has been increasing from about 12% in 1996 to 24.9% in 2016. The significance of trade has been particularly more because the intra-regional exports of the developing countries have increased from about 42%